Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Kathryn Cramer Brownell, who teaches at Purdue University, and her area of research is politics and popular culture as it's portrayed and influenced by the news media and media in general. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your new book is 24/7 Politics, Cable Television, and the Fragmenting of America from Watergate to Fox News. And a lot of your focus then is on cable television and its impact. Can we start with that?
Absolutely.
Okay. How did that, in a general way, how did that change the political landscape?
Well, there is a big shift that happens over the course of the 20th century, is that you go from this post-World War II era that's dominated by network broadcast television and three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they dominate news and entertainment program. They dominate the information that people receive about the world around them, and they create kind of this shared culture.
The good and the bad of that. On the one hand, it created a kind of a national consensus on who we were and where we were going, right? But on the other hand, it boxed out all kinds of other opinions and ideas, right?
Yes, it was very exclusionary.
Yeah.
It prioritized the view and the voices of elite white heterosexual men. It was ideologically exclusionary as well. And so yes, it bolstered the political establishment. And there's this really powerful relationship that forms between presidents like Eisenhower and Kennedy in particular and network television. They're friends. And they help to advance a similar narrative and perhaps not challenge the official point of view coming out of Washington.
That starts to change with cable TV, but the cable TV, I guess, starts, it's around very early, right?
Yeah.
But we really see the impact of it in the 80s, right?
So cable television really starts with television. It originally it's known as community antenna television, or CATV. And it starts to flourish in communities in rural Pennsylvania or Oregon, where smaller communities are struggling to get access to broadcast signals from major cities. And so really innovative business people climb up to the top of a mountain, set up a satellite, and then wire a connection to homes in that smaller area. And so initially it functioned as an expansion of broadcast, not a challenge to it.
So no one at that time thought it was going to compete with broadcast.
Absolutely not. And then what's really interesting is throughout the 1960s, the FCC made sure it didn't compete. Even though there was kind of a demand for more programming and more voices on the broadcast channel, FCC policy upheld this monopoly of the big three. And it made it so cable could not challenge broadcast television. And so regulatory policies restricted that it couldn't enter the top 100 markets. It couldn't offer anything that directly challenged that programming and competed with broadcast television. So it's not just a lack of vision, it's actual federal policy as well.
Yeah, and that began to change with what?
So that begins to change by the late 1960s as people across the political spectrum, conservatives, civil rights activists, feminists, they're very unhappy with that exclusionary culture and vision of the news that's advanced by network television. And so they start to clamor for opportunities for more media access, for different points of view. And I argue in the book that the Nixon administration is actually a really significant moment in shaping the trajectory of cable television because Richard Nixon hated broadcast television.
Oh, that's right, yes.
He hated the media.
He lost that election for governor of California, and he gave his concession speeches, and I think he said the news media won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore, right?
Yeah. And what's so
interesting,
interesting about that speech is that he then goes on to blame it's media bias, right? Like, that he thought that the television in particular, that they were out to get him. But he also goes on to lament lack of media coverage. And that, people should just put a reporter on a campaign even if they think they're going to lose. And so he also thought it wasn't just negative coverage of him, but that people weren't fully covering him, and they were ignoring him at different aspects. And so that's why cable was so appealing to him, because it actually offered more opportunities for different coverage of political candidates and elected officials. And that's why a lot of people in Congress bought into the promise of cable, because they were increasingly seeing TV as central to political power. And as a way for Congress to reassert itself into the national conversation. And cable offered an opportunity that network broadcast television did not.
So on both sides of the political spectrum then, people felt that more coverage was more opportunity for them. And interesting that this starts in the Nixon era, though, because he has his speechwriters writing this series of speeches that Agnew goes around the country giving, attacking the news media, calling them nabobs of negativism, and,
of course.
and all those famous quotes, right?
And do you know who another person attacking the news media was?
At that time?
At that time, in the Nixon administration, that was very vocal about the criticisms of the elitism and the ideological plugola is Clay Whitehead.
Oh, really? I know. I thought you were going to say his press secretary, of course.
Well, of course. I mean, everyone in the Nixon administration was on point to attack the media. But Clay Whitehead is really interesting because he was the director of the Office of Telecommunications Policy. And so he really gets involved in this attack against network news and this public criticism of them. But he also is involved in reshaping cable policy and thinking about, okay, this is an opportunity to use Nixon's war on the media to advance a different regulatory policy and to start to deregulate cable television to allow it to compete against broadcast. So it's, this campaign to critique broadcast and to kind of get the public to lose faith in the integrity of network newsrooms, but it's also a behind-the-scenes policy shift as well.
And then in the Carter administration, the policies start to change.
So there's an interesting moment in the Ford administration that I was actually not anticipating. But the archives, what I found is that, so there are the Watergate hearings that are a major television event, and it's really broadcast that steps up to cover the hearings during the day. It's a boom to public television because they replay the hearings at night. And it really is seen as this transformative moment where, because of television, the people could have faith in the Senate investigation. And then when they start to move on impeachment, there's a lot of discussion that we need to have these impeachment hearings and these votes televised so that people can kind of bring integrity to the process. So Congress in the aftermath realizes that they need TV to kind of assert their own stars in this media landscape, but also to hold the president accountable. What's really fascinating is in the Ford administration that there's new research that comes out that actually shows that cable can be good for the television business, that there's a public demand for different types of programming during the day. And so Ford has this team of economists that actually start to research cable and to take it seriously. And it's this economic research that ultimately gets squashed by Ford's relationship with broadcasters, that they helped to kind of squash it under his administration, but that really is the fodder for later deregulatory policies under Carter.
The result of this is, right, that instead of having 3 news sources or 4, depending on where you're at, right, you now have this ever-expanding range of information that's coming in at you. How does that impact the political landscape compared to what it was like before?
So it takes a while. You begin to have new channels. First, they're overwhelmingly entertainment channels like HBO. Really start to generate an audience, and they're now available via satellite. So the economics of the technology makes more sense with satellites. But then you have C-SPAN comes in 1979, and that all of a sudden It's a very small viewership. It's perhaps only a few million at first, and then it starts to grow, but that's nothing compared with network television. They still dominate political conversations in the 1980s.
And just to interject here, so but pick this up in a second, but so we've got this Watergate coverage, which is kind of a new phenomenon, right? Everybody's watching this. And then the next big phenomenon like that is probably the hostage crisis under Carter, right? And so everybody's back on watching TV again, and they're waiting for reporters to come up with latest information, and they're watching things, happening on C-SPAN eventually, right? And what was the Ted Koppel show that came on that was covering nightly, right? Covering nightly news. Okay, so now in the midst of all of this, what's cable doing?
So cable is now getting more and more people to believe in it.
Yeah.
It's getting more and more subscribers. They're saying that, there's this whole plethora of entertainment and sports and news that you're not getting. Don't you want to sign up? So they're starting to get subscribers. And so it's starting to grow with that. But perhaps more importantly, they're starting to get members of Congress who become invested in its expansion. That's the brilliance of C-SPAN, is that it made members of Congress see, I'm now a star of the show. I can find ways to insert myself into the national media landscape. Wouldn't it be good if cable actually expanded to new areas and allowed me to have even more of a larger audience and more of a national profile? And so C-SPAN becomes a way that elected officials become invested personally in cable's growth.
And Newt Gingrich is one of the people who really capitalizes on that. Tell us about Newt Gingrich.
So Newt Gingrich is a new style of conservative that comes into the Republican Party post-Watergate. And
he's a professor, I think, right?
He was a history professor.
Yes.
But when he came into politics, he was combative. And he told his people on the campaign trail that he was going to fight. He was going to, stand up and do anything he could to raise a ruckus. And that's exactly what he does. And C-SPAN becomes one of his favorite ways to do that. And he starts to notice, and in fact, it's actually Democrats that recognize this opportunity first, that for special orders. At the end of the legislative day, there's an opportunity for a special order where the session has convened, but an elector, a representative can go to the well of the floor, or the well of the House, and say, I'd like to use this to make a statement about something. Sometimes previously it was used to wish happy anniversary. It wasn't used for anything substantive.
It was less formal.
Exactly.
And let me interject for people that don't know about the history of all of this. C-SPAN was one of the first big innovations of cable television, and basically they had a camera in Congress that just basically broadcast everything that was going on from opening till close, right?
Yes.
And so you're talking about a period at the end of the day, basically, where people normally didn't pay any attention to what was going on there because it was sort of an informal mention my constituents in Congress kind of a thing. But C-SPAN was still rolling, and there were perhaps nerdy people watching this that late, right?
Perhaps. But remember, this is actually probably at like 7 o'clock at night.
Yes.
So while it was after the legislative session, it's actually primetime viewing for TV. And the camera zoomed in. So rather than show an empty chamber, it just showed the person speaking. So Gingrich recognizes that he can use this as a way to speak to, maybe there are only 2,000 people watching, but that was better than nothing. And he uses it as a way to rant and call out his Democratic opponents, to call out any moderate Republicans that were willing to compromise. He saw that as something, as a liability. And so he calls people out and he challenges, their integrity, calls them to confront him on this issue. And to a television viewer, no one confronts Gingrich. I guess they're scared of him. Well, there's no one in the chamber. And so there's this really interesting moment in May of 1984 when Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, is so angry at these tactics that he thinks are just unfair because they're deceiving television viewers, that he orders, and it's Bob Walker of Pennsylvania who's on camera giving one of his diatribes, and so Gingrich orders the cameras to pan to show the empty scene, or that that they're not talking to anyone, and it just causes this conflict, this huge spectacle over camera camera angles that was called Cam Scam. And it was one of the really fascinating parts of research for this book.
And this evolves into what becomes the Republican Revolution, essentially, right? And this wave of Republican victories, all levels of campaigning, right, across the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Gingrich loved it. He loved Cam Scan because even though there's a lot of criticism leveraged at him, he ultimately gets in this confrontation with O'Neill, and then that confrontation really elevated Gingrich. Now he's on the talk shows. He's on network news, right? So cable becomes a way for people to experiment with different ideas, for new extremist voices to kind of come in, try a lot of controversial ideas, and see what generates ratings.
And then transfer that to interviews on the big networks, right?
Exactly.
And spread it out. Yeah. So we start to see a lot of anti-establishment arguments appearing during this time, right? That we didn't see before. So let's talk about that a little bit, but first let's talk about why we didn't see so many anti-establishment arguments in the old days before there was cable. It was a consensus machine, basically, right? How would you describe that? From your point of view?
I think that's what it was. There's this shared culture that comes out of network television, but I think also equally important to that are the relationships that presidential administrations have with executives. There's this one moment where John F. Kennedy gives a speech and tells the press corps that we're fighting the Cold War. So the Cold War is a key factor here, and so you need to trust the presidency, trust what we do. Don't necessarily challenge us on everything because there's this national security interest as well. So there's a personal relationship between executives and the presidency, but also
they're going to the same parties.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And okay, so now cable happens, and in addition to what's happening on C-SPAN, right, you're getting also other people who aren't necessarily in Congress raising issues and getting attention. And where does that take us?
So during the 1980s, you have kind of this flowering of all of these new perspectives and these different cable networks that emerge. You've got, daytime that emerges and has a news program geared towards women. You've got, evangelical programs and the 700 Club that is crafting news programs for social or conservatives. And so you've got all of these different perspectives that are emerging. And so again, it's a fragmenting, as I call it in my book, but it's all of these different, it's market segmentation, these niche audiences. And what cable networks realize is that they need to they don't need a mass audience, they need a loyal audience. One that will, if the cable operator threatens to drop that channel, ones that will put up a ruckus and make sure that that doesn't happen.
So now they're seeing themselves at this point basically as businesses, and we're talking about profit motive here, right? Now,
Absolutely.
Now, for comparison, we go back to the 50s and 60s. Reporters saw themselves as the fourth estate, and they felt that they were sort of this unelected estate of government almost, right? And they were keeping the other three estates honest, and they had a calling, I think you might say, right? I think they saw it that way, and they were willing to put themselves in jeopardy. Newspapers were willing to take risks in order to get information out for the public good, right? But now we've got a shift, you're saying, right? And with this shift, we're really just seeing news production as a profit-loss equation.
So I think it's a little more complicated because, yes, I think television journalists, they tried to get, they questioned objectivity, but they tried to be accurate in their reporting.
And they took risks with the Pentagon Papers and things like that, right? Covering Watergate.
Exactly. So I think that there is, and again, network television is a little bit different in that capacity. And yes, they're trying. Someone like Walter Cronkite does believe that he's trying to get the information to the people about what's going on.
And we believed that too.
And he believed
we never
it.
doubted it.
But there's also a component, and network executives believed in their civic responsibility to invest in the news. But it's not just altruism. That there's they made money. They made
Right.
money off of network news, and even though they frequently tried to hide their profits to show that they were doing this out of a civic good rather than any kind of profit motive,
Yeah.
it was driven by profits too.
Well, and it was also driven by the print media, the print news, because the print news was essentially keeping the broadcast news honest, because if they got it wrong, some reporter was going to write, they might do a 2-minute story on national TV at 6 o'clock, but some reporter for the New York Times might work all week and do 12 interviews and write a 3-page story essentially, right? That gets into the details that they skirted over on television. So it kind of, the balance with the newspapers kept that honest, right?
Well, and the
And that balance is gone now too.
Yeah, and the newspapers, you're right. They could pursue some of these stories
Yeah.
that took more time, right?
Yeah.
That were more controversial. The network television didn't necessarily have that opportunity because, or they weren't willing to risk it, I should say, because they also operated on a broadcast license that was federally regulated. And so questioning the federal government, calling attention to this was something they would only do if they they felt that their licenses weren't at risk.
And you use the term, I think, echo chamber in your book. So you're saying that this new configuration here creates a situation then where someone can really only, if they want, can just look for news sources that are going to echo opinions that they already have and not expose themselves to contrary opinions or not have to defend their opinions, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things to remember about echo chambers is that it is very good for the business of television, but not necessarily good for American democracy. And this is something that the MTV, for example, recognized. In the 1992 election, they launched this really innovative choose or lose campaign where they were covering the election for their viewers, a younger demographic. But the whole idea behind it was, yes, they were going to inform their viewers, but they wanted them not to turn the channel. They didn't want them to get their political information from ABC, NBC, or CBS. They wanted to personalize it for their viewers about issues they cared about, but it gave them a very narrow understanding of the broader issues of that election and the strengths of those candidates.
So let's throw Trump into the conversation here now. So a lot of the analysis of his success in his campaign for president the first time gives credit to social media. What was the role of cable television in this?
So, I argue in the book that Trump, really embodies the shifting cultural values we have in the age of cable television. He becomes a celebrity CEO in the 1980s, and he's able to kind of tap into that environment. He launches his media career on reality television, and that is a style of show that cable showed could be profitable by kind of bringing that outrage. He taps into that tradition that people like Newt Gingrich introduced of trying to generate controversy in order to get media coverage. So he taps into all of these traditions of cable television and then uses cable to dominate the media narrative during the 2016 election. And of course, the relationship between Fox News and Donald Trump is the embodiment of narrowcasting, right? Fox News is literally talking to the president and vice versa. And so they become so ingratiated with the Fox News becomes so ingratiated with the Trump administration that they're trading personnel, they're trading ideas. And it's a relationship that cable pioneers would have never dreamed of.
And so where are we today?
Oh, where are we today? Well, I think that, today is clearly there's a lot of discussion about, is it the end of cable news? Is it the end of cable television with so many people cutting the cord, right? And streaming services are really on the uptick. And I think that it's a moment to really, that's a significant significant in the trajectory of cable television. It's, as a business model, it will change moving forward. But what I argue in my book are the values and the practices that cable brought to American politics will persist, and they will actually become more deeply embedded in the political environment and the media environment as well. And that is the appeal to niche audiences. That is the personalization of news.
Yeah.
That is, trying to generate ratings and using ratings as a barometer of success. In both politics and media.
Right.
And while ratings has always been tied to media, having that as a barometer of success in politics brings up fundamental challenges for American democracy.
When you look at all this in terms of politics, right, we've come from a situation where before the expansion of cable, the United States came to consensus on a lot of issues, right? And we've got a situation today, I think most of us would agree, where we have a lot of conflicting opinions about things, and we're having great difficulty coming to consensus on issues. So there's a trade-off there, isn't there? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you see that? How do you process that?
Yeah, I think there's a trade-off. I think that there actually is more consensus on issues than we frequently assume. Issues about climate and climate change and gun control. I think there are a range of issues that Americans agree upon. But
it might not seem that way.
But it might not seem that way. And I think you're right. The flood of opinions, right? That there's this busyness that can be overwhelming, that can distract from issues that we actually want to get resolved, and also just the mechanics of government, that it's become so tied to media spectacle that it becomes about how you will be seen rather than what you will be doing while in office.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your insights. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Kathryn Cramer Brownell for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.